Welcome to a Sherlock Holmes mystery. A snowbound village, a church whose bells ring themselves, and a secret buried in silence. What truth hides beneath the sound? Where are you listening from tonight? Tell us below. The frost lay thick upon Baker Street, that Christmas Eve, painting every gas lamp in halos of crystal light. The carolers had long since passed, their voices fading into the soft hush of falling snow, when a heavy rap sounded upon our door. Mrs. Hudson, startled by the lateness of the hour, glanced nervously toward the sitting room. Holmes, as ever, appeared unaffected. He sat cross-legged upon the hearthrug, a violin resting against his shoulder, his eyes half closed as he drew a low, plaintive note that seemed to echo the loneliness of the night itself. "Come in," he called, without moving. The door opened to admit a man wrapped in a fur-lined cloak, his boots caked with ice and his expression one of grave agitation. The figure removed his hat and stepped into the light, revealing a tall, silver-haired gentleman whose every movement suggested authority and distress in equal measure. "My name is Reverend Dr. Charles Penrith," he said, his breath still visible in the cold air. "I have come from St. Agatha's Church in Surrey, Mr. Holmes, and I beg your immediate assistance." Holmes rose, setting aside the violin. "The bells, I presume," he said quietly. "They have ceased to ring." The clergyman's eyes widened. "How on earth did you?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Your gloves, sir, are lined with wax dust, and the faint imprint of a rope burn mars your right palm, an occupational mark of one accustomed to bell ringing. The distress upon your face is not of personal injury, but of something sacrilegious or inexplicable. Thus, the silence of church bells on Christmas Eve, a calamity to one in your station, seemed the only logical conclusion. I could not suppress a laugh. "Holmes, you astonish even the clergy now." But Reverend Penrith did not share my amusement. He seated himself heavily, his hands trembling. "Mr. Holmes, the bells of St. Agatha's have rung every Christmas Eve for more than 2 centuries. Tonight, for the first time in history, they are silent, and not by any earthly cause. The tower ropes move of their own accord. The great tenor bell strikes once each midnight hour. Yet no man lays a hand upon it. 3 nights in succession this has happened, and now the verger has vanished." Holmes regarded him with intense curiosity. "Vanished?" "Without trace. He was last seen ascending the bell tower shortly after sunset yesterday. When the sexton went to relieve him, the door was bolted from within. It was forced open this morning. No sign of the man save his lantern, still burning beside the great bell." Holmes turned to me, his eyes glinting. "A locked-room mystery in a church tower, Watson. How admirably seasonal." "But surely," I protested, "it may be no more than some local superstition or nervous fancy. You said yourself, Holmes, that village tales often exaggerate." "Indeed, but the Reverend's tone does not suggest invention. Ghostly bells that toll without human aid, a vanished verger, and a bolted door, no. Watson, this promises substance." "Reverend Penrith, you have my full attention." The clergyman produced a sealed envelope. "This morning I found this upon my desk. It bears no name, no address, merely a line written in red ink. 'When the bells fall silent, the dead shall walk again.'" Holmes examined the note under the lamplight. Good paper, foreign, Italian manufacture. Ink smudged in haste. The hand tremulous but deliberate, likely female. "Interesting." He tapped the edge of the paper. "And you are certain no one in the parish could have placed it?" "Quite certain. The church doors are locked each night at 8. Holmes crossed to his desk and drew a large map from the cairns. Drawer. "St. Agatha's, you said?" "Near Chertsey, if memory serves. Surrounded by marshland on 3 sides, with the Thames curving close behind the rectory grounds. The perfect stage for both illusion and disappearance." I watched as he marked the map with swift precision. "You intend to go tonight?" "Of course, my dear Watson. Mystery does not observe holidays." He glanced at the window, where snow pressed against the panes like restless spirits. "Pack your revolver and a warm coat. If my deductions are correct, we may find the explanation less ghostly than the good Reverend believes, but infinitely more dangerous." Penrith rose, gratitude softening his anxiety. "I thank you, Mr. Holmes. If we catch the 10 o'clock train, we shall arrive before midnight." "Excellent! The witching hour will suit our investigation perfectly." Holmes turned to me with a familiar gleam of anticipation. "I fancy, Watson, that before dawn we shall hear more than silence from those bells." As the Reverend departed to make ready, Holmes stood by the window, his tall figure outlined against the pale light. "Consider, Watson," he murmured, "bells that toll unseen, a vanished man, and a message foretelling the walking dead. Superstition may hide a most human malice. It is the task of reason to uncover it." Outside, the snow fell thicker, muffling the world. The bells of nearby churches began to ring, joyous and clear. Only Street, Agatha's, miles away, would remain silent that night, waiting for Sherlock Holmes. The journey to Surrey was shrouded in an almost spectral quiet. The carriage lamps flickered dimly against the swirling curtain of snow, and beyond the frost-blurred windows, the night stretched wide and solemn, broken only by the whistle of the distant train. Holmes sat opposite me, his sharp profile half lit by the rhythmic flash of passing signal lights. His gaze fixed not on me, but on the reflection of the darkness outside. Reverend Penrith dozed restlessly beside him, clutching his cloak, his lips moving in some silent prayer. I had long ceased trying to guess at the nature of Holmes's thoughts, though the faint drumming of his fingers upon the seat betrayed that his mind was already at work. "Watson," he said at last, breaking the hush, "you have observed, perhaps, that the Reverend's story contains more than one contradiction." I looked up. "Contradiction? I confess, Holmes, I heard nothing but the plain account of a good man troubled by uncanny events." "Just so," he murmured, "and yet the good man's distress is colored by omission. He said the verger vanished last evening, yet he failed to mention who last saw him alive or what business the man had atop the tower after dark. A church bell, Watson, is not wound like a clock. It is rung by will and muscle. Why ascend the tower when the bells had already been silent for days? That, I suspect, is our first loose thread." The train shrieked as it entered a tunnel, the sound echoing like a cry across the iron ribs of the carriage. When we emerged again, the first faint glimmers of Chertsey's gaslights twinkled through the snow. The Reverend stirred, murmured something about divine providence, and gathered his things. By the time we stepped down onto the platform, the air bit sharply at our faces. The small country station was deserted save for a single porter asleep upon his bench. A waiting trap stood ready, its horse steaming and stamping impatiently. Penrith led us aboard, and we rattled through the white-mantled lanes until the squat spire of Street. Agatha's appeared through the mist, rising dark and rigid above the clustered cottages. Even in the muffled quiet of the night, there was an air of foreboding about it. No Christmas lights gleamed from its windows. Only the outline of the bell tower loomed against the clouded sky, stark and silent as a monument. Holmes alighted first and turned, slowly, his keen eyes sweeping over the churchyard. "Remarkable stillness," he said under his breath. "Not even the whisper of wind among the graves." He stooped to examine a set of prints half hidden in the snow. 3 sets of tracks, 1 light, 2 heavier. The light one leads toward the tower door. I presume those belong to your missing verger, Reverend?" Penrith nodded uncertainly. Yes, they might. His name was Thomas Avery, a faithful man, though lately much disturbed. He swore he heard voices in the belfry chanting. He said, though none believed him. Holmes straightened. "Voices. Curious. And these heavier prints?" "The constable and myself," said Penrith quietly. "We broke the door at dawn." Holmes touched the lock, running a finger along the splintered wood. "Forced inward, from without, yet the bolt remains on the inside." He examined it more closely, then smiled faintly. Ah, someone was at pains to create an illusion. The bolt is filed clean through on one end. It could be set from without and give every impression of a barricade within. Ingenious, but amateur. We entered the tower. The air was heavy and cold, thick with the scent of oil and old stone. Holmes raised the lantern, its glow trembling across the narrow spiral of steps that wound upward into darkness. On the lower stair lay a small scrap of paper, torn roughly along one edge. Holmes bent and picked it up. Half a church ledger page, inked in the same red as the warning note. He said softly, "Watson, do you perceive what that implies?" That the author of the threat was here, precisely and recently. He tucked it into his coat and began to ascend, his long fingers grazing the damp stones as we climbed. The wind moaned faintly through unseen cracks. Somewhere above us, a rope creaked as if stirred by invisible hands. The Reverend muttered a prayer, and I must confess a chill touched my spine. At the top landing, we emerged into the bell chamber. The vast bronze bells hung like frozen sentinels, their surfaces dusted with frost. A single lantern flickered upon the floor beside a coiled rope, its flame wavering weakly. Holmes examined the ground, then crouched. "Blood," he whispered. "Barely a few drops, but recent. And look there," Watson, the impression of a heel sliding toward the trapdoor. I followed his gaze. The narrow hatch gaped open, revealing a black void that descended into the church below. Holmes knelt at its edge, his eyes glittering in the dim light. "No sign of a fall," he murmured. And yet something or someone was lowered here. The rope frays slightly at this section. The bell did not ring by ghostly hand, my dear Watson. It was made to ring by design. The question is whose? The wind rose suddenly, carrying with it a faint metallic sound. It was not the full toll of a bell, but a single hollow chime that seemed to drift up from the frozen earth below. Reverend Penrith cried out softly, his face blanched. Holmes remained perfectly still, head tilted, listening as the echo faded into the night. Then, almost to himself, he said, "The bells are not silent after all, they are speaking, in code." Holmes leaned farther over the open trapdoor, his keen eyes studying the darkness below. The faint metallic reverberation still lingered like a whisper in the cold air. He drew his lantern closer, the trembling light illuminating the rough-hewn beams and the frayed end of the rope that disappeared into shadow. "Watson," he murmured, "observe the fiber coarse hemp, but freshly cut. Someone severed it deliberately within the past 24 hours, and yet the mark is clean, not frayed by wear. Whoever did this possessed a steady hand and a sharp blade." He lowered himself to his knees, holding the rope taut between thumb and forefinger. "Note also the faint residue of soot upon the hemp. There's been fire near this place, though not within the tower. That suggests either the crypt below or the furnace of the rectory." Reverend Penrith, visibly shaken, clutched the nearest beam for support. "Mr. Holmes, do you mean to say this ghastly business was no act of spirits, that a mortal hand caused it?" Holmes smiled faintly, his eyes glittering in the dim light. "My dear Reverend, in my experience, ghosts leave fewer fingerprints and seldom take the trouble to cut ropes with such precision." He rose and brushed the dust from his knees. "You mentioned that your verger, Thomas Avery, was a faithful man, yet troubled. Was there anyone in your parish who bore him ill will, or perhaps sought something within this tower that he might have guarded?" Penrith hesitated, then crossed himself. "There was one, though I scarce dare mention her. A woman named Margaret Vale. She was once a chorister at Street, Agatha's, many years ago, before her dismissal. Some said she dabbled in the occult. She returned to the village last month, claiming the church had stolen her inheritance. Avery confronted her publicly. There was talk of curses." Holmes's expression grew intent. "A woman wronged, a missing man, and a tower said to ring itself. The pattern sharpens, Watson. Revenge cloaked in superstition, a most serviceable disguise. He paced slowly around the chamber, examining every inch of the floor. The lantern light caught upon something glinting between the boards. Holmes knelt swiftly, extracted a small object with the tip of his knife, and held it up for inspection. It was a thin piece of metal, half an inch long, slightly curved and bearing the trace of grease. "A clockmaker's pivot pin," he said softly, "or part of a mechanical gear. Tell me, Reverend, who maintains the bell's mechanism?" "No one, Mr. Holmes," said Penrith, bewildered. "They are rung by hand only." Holmes slipped the fragment into his pocket. "Then someone has been meddling with your ropes, replacing strength with mechanism. I suspect your mysterious midnight toll was no phantom at all, but a timed contrivance. It remains to be seen what purpose it served and why your verger vanished before its final performance." We descended carefully, the narrow stair groaning beneath our steps. The church lay below in solemn darkness, its pews casting long shadows across the stone floor. As Holmes passed through the nave, his lantern revealed faint smudges leading from the tower to the vestry footprints, half obscured by snow that had drifted in through a broken pane. He crouched again, tracing them with delicate precision. "Two persons," he said. "One heavier, likely Avery. The other lighter, smaller, and wearing boots with a broken heel. The prints cross near the altar rail, then diverge. The lighter set continues toward the crypt entrance." "Margaret Vale?" I ventured. "Perhaps. Or someone wishing us to believe so. Come, Watson. Bring the light." We followed the trail to the small iron door at the foot of the nave. The Reverend hesitated as Holmes unlatched it, the hinges protesting with a hollow groan. A breath of icy air wafted up from below, carrying the damp scent of earth and candle smoke. The steps descended into near total darkness. Holmes moved ahead without pause, his lantern held low. "The air is recently disturbed," he murmured. "Someone has been here within the hour." The crypt was a narrow chamber, lined with stone recesses, where old coffins lay sealed behind brass plaques. In the center stood a small table covered with a velvet cloth, and upon it, arranged in eerie symmetry, rested a collection of parish relics, candlesticks, a rusted cross, and an open prayer book whose pages fluttered slightly in the draught. But what drew Holmes's attention was a set of fresh footprints circling the table and a small leather satchel half hidden beneath it. He knelt and opened it carefully. Inside lay a length of fine copper wire, a coil spring, and several tiny brass gears. Holmes's voice was low but electric with discovery. "Watson, this is no accident. Someone has constructed a timed ringing device, one capable of striking a bell long after the tower is deserted, a clever means of inspiring terror while masking other pursuits. And note these materials are identical to those used in watchmaking." Reverend Penrith made the sign of the cross. "Then the ghost of the bells was no more than machinery?" "Machinery and misdirection," Holmes replied. "But we have yet to learn what it concealed." He rose abruptly, his eyes gleaming in the lantern's light. "Watson, the game quickens. Whoever built this mechanism returned here tonight, and if I am not mistaken, we are but minutes behind them." Even as he spoke, a sound drifted faintly from the nave above a soft scrape, like a door being eased shut. Holmes extinguished the lantern in a heartbeat. We stood in utter darkness, the cold pressing close around us. Then, from somewhere above, came the slow toll of a single bell, deliberate and chilling, echoing down through the stones. Holmes's whisper reached my ear, calm but charged with purpose. "Now, Watson, our phantom toller walks in the flesh." For a few moments we stood motionless in the crypt, listening to the echo fade like the dying breath of a spectre. Holmes's hand closed firmly on my shoulder, urging silence. Then, with cat-like precision, he moved toward the stair. I followed as softly as my boots would allow, the darkness broken only by the faint silver glow filtering through the cracks in the wooden trapdoor above. Each step creaked with menace. Somewhere in the church, a door clicked shut, and the faint scrape of movement stirred the air. Holmes paused, every nerve alert. "One person," he whispered. "Light step, moving toward the vestry." We reached the top, and Holmes pushed the trap open an inch. Through the gap, I saw the dim nave bathed in ghostly half-light. The great windows caught the distant moon, their colored panes now muted to shades of gray and blue. A single lantern flickered near the altar, casting monstrous shadows that danced across the pews. Holmes motioned for silence, then slid out, gliding through the darkness like a shadow himself. I followed close behind, revolver drawn. Near the altar rail, a faint rustle broke the stillness. A cloaked figure was kneeling before the chancel, its face hidden, the lantern's glow trembling over slender hands as they worked feverishly at something upon the floor. I caught a glimpse of wire, a small metal box, and a tangle of bell rope. Holmes crouched low behind a pew, his eyes glittering with that cold fire I had seen so many times before when the game was near its height. Suddenly, he moved. In 3 swift strides, he was upon the figure, seizing its wrist before it could snatch up the device. A cry escaped a woman's voice, sharp and startled. The lantern fell, rolling across the stones, its light flaring wildly before settling. Holmes held fast, his tone even but commanding. "Margaret Vale, I believe. Your ghosts have rung their last bell." The woman struggled, then stilled. Beneath the hood, I saw a pale face framed by dark hair, eyes wide with fury and fear. How did you?" she began, but Holmes silenced her with a glance. "There will be time for that presently. Watson, the lantern, if you please." I retrieved it, setting it upright upon the rail. Holmes examined the contrivance she had been assembling, a small spring-driven hammer mechanism affixed to a coil of copper. "Crude, yet effective," he said. "It would strike the interior of the bell rope's pulley, producing a chime indistinguishable from the real article, ingenious enough to frighten a village into hysteria." Margaret Vale's lips curved into a bitter smile. "You think this is about fear, Mr. Holmes? You're wrong. It's about justice." "Justice?" he repeated, his voice dry as parchment. "My father built this church," she hissed, "and died penniless while your precious reverend's family grew fat upon his labor. They stole the land beneath our cottage, drove us out, and buried my father's name beneath their stone saints. I swore street. Agatha's would never know peace again until truth rang louder than lies." Holmes regarded her for a long moment, neither mocking nor sympathetic. "And your truth required the death of Thomas Avery?" The color drained from her face. "I did not kill him," she said hoarsely. "He helped me. He pitied me. He understood. But he grew afraid. Last night, he tried to stop me from placing the final mechanism. We struggled near the trapdoor. He slipped." Her voice faltered, breaking into a sob. Holmes's expression did not change, yet his tone softened slightly. "He fell into the nave?" "No, not far. The rope caught him. He hung there, silent, until I cut him down. I laid him beneath the crypt stairs. I meant to take him away before dawn." Holmes exhaled, slowly. So the silence of the bells was not supernatural after all, it was guilt that muted them. He glanced toward me. "Watson, you recall the soot upon the rope? It was from her lantern, used during her nocturnal work." I nodded grimly. "And the note? The threat about the dead walking again?" "A poetic flourish, no doubt," Holmes said, "but one written to mislead, to cast suspicion upon some spectral hand rather than her own." Margaret's eyes flashed. "You speak of deceit as though you've never known desperation." Holmes straightened, his expression unreadable. "Desperation, yes, but not delusion. You might have exposed your grievance in daylight, before witnesses. Instead, you wove terror and took a man's life, intentionally or not. Justice, Miss Vale, does not wear a cloak." At that moment, the church door burst open, and the chill of dawn swept through. Inspector Lestrade entered, his moustache rimed with frost, 2 constables at his heels. "Holmes, Reverend Penrith fetched us, said you'd uncovered something unholy." Holmes gestured calmly toward the kneeling woman and the apparatus at her feet. No spirits here. Lestrade only the familiar machinery of human folly. Take her gently. She has rung her own knell this night. As the constables led her away, she turned once, her eyes fixed upon the silent tower. "They'll ring again," she whispered. "The bells always do." Holmes watched her go, his gaze distant. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he murmured, "Indeed they shall, but next time, in morning." When Margaret Vale was taken away, the dawn had only begun to grey the eastern sky. The snow outside the church shimmered faintly beneath the first light, and within, the air hung heavy with the mingled scents of wax, dust, and the metallic tang of cold brass. Holmes stood motionless at the altar rail, his gaze resting upon the great bell rope that hung in loose coils from the tower. He did not speak for some time, and even Lestrade, usually full of questions, seemed struck into silence by the solemnity of the scene. At last, Holmes drew a deep breath and turned toward us. "Lestrade, you will ensure that the verger's body is recovered from beneath the crypt stairs. It must be handled with discretion. I should prefer the villagers not learn the particulars until morning. There has been enough superstition for one season." Lestrade nodded briskly and departed with his men. The echo of their boots faded, leaving only the creak of timbers as the cold settled in again. I moved closer to Holmes, who stood studying the device Margaret had built. Its spring still glinted faintly in the lamplight. "Holmes," I said, "the case seems closed," the woman confessed. "You have your mechanism, your motive, your tragedy. What troubles you now?" He did not immediately reply. His fingers toyed with the copper wire, his eyes distant. "Watson, confession is not always synonymous with truth. There remains one detail, one small, stubborn detail which refuses to fit. When we discovered the satchel in the crypt, it contained all the tools required for her contrivance. Yet look here," he held up the mechanism. "This gear is of a finer make than any in her kit. Precision work, cut with machinery, not by hand. Miss Vale may have conceived this trick, but I doubt she constructed it alone." I frowned. "You mean she had an accomplice?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps she made use of someone's workshop." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Did you observe, earlier, the blackened stains upon the inside of the vestry window? They were no mere soot marks, they were residue of oil smoke, consistent with metal polishing. And there is one man in this parish, I believe, who keeps a forge." "Penrith's groundskeeper?" I suggested. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Exactly. Mr. Elias Trent, former machinist, dismissed from his post at the railworks some years ago for theft of materials. According to the Reverend, he now tends the rectory garden. I should like a word with him before breakfast." We left the church together, the cold biting our faces, the snow crunching beneath our boots. Beyond the churchyard, the rectory loomed through the mist, its chimneys trailing thin plumes of smoke. Holmes rapped upon the door with his stick. After a moment, a burly man with a soot-darkened beard appeared, his expression wary. "Morning, sirs. Reverend's not yet risen." "It is you we seek," Holmes said evenly. "Mr. Trent, I believe. Might we step inside?" The man hesitated, then shrugged and led us into a small kitchen, its air thick with the scent of coal and oil. A bench stood near the hearth, strewn with metal filings and the half-assembled skeleton of a clock. Holmes's eyes flicked over the work table, taking in every detail. "A fine hand for gears," he said lightly. "You have not lost your old trade, it seems." Trent stiffened. "I make repairs for the village. No crime in that." "Of course not," Holmes replied, his tone pleasant. "Nor in lending a hand to a neighbor. Miss Margaret Vale, for instance. Did you happen to assist her in building a small device, one capable of striking a bell without human touch?" The man's face drained of color. I don't know what you mean." Holmes stepped closer, his voice calm but cutting. "Come, Mr. Trent. The evidence of your craft is plain. The oil upon your hands, the residue of copper dust, and the faint scent of waxed hemp. You forged her tools, perhaps at first in ignorance, but when she spoke of revenge, you found cause to help her. Did she promise you a share of her inheritance?" Trent's jaw worked soundlessly. Then, with a sudden motion, he reached for something behind him, a wrench glinting in the dim light. But Holmes was faster. With a swift twist of his cane, he sent the weapon clattering to the floor. I stepped forward, revolver drawn, as Trent slumped onto a stool, defeated. "Yes," he muttered hoarsely, "I made it for her. I thought she only wanted to frighten the Reverend. She said no one would be hurt. Then she came to me last night, blood on her hands, begging for help. I told her to go, to burn the thing and leave. But she said she had one more bell to ring." Holmes regarded him coolly. "A pity you did not stop her sooner. Still, your admission may spare you the gallows." He turned to me. "Watson," informed Lestrade, "Mr. Trent will accompany us back to London. I believe Scotland Yard will have questions regarding several missing clock parts from the Guildhall inventory." Trent's shoulders sagged. Holmes drew on his gloves and gazed out the frosted window. The dawn had fully broken now, spilling pale gold across the church spire. "You see, Watson," he said softly, "even in crimes of passion, the machinery of guilt is rarely built by one hand alone. It takes two to make a bell ring, one to pull the rope, the other to forge the sound." I followed his gaze toward Street Agatha's, where the silent bells gleamed faintly in the light. "And yet," I murmured, "for all their stillness, they seem to echo still." Holmes smiled faintly. "Indeed, the echoes of conscience. My dear Watson, those are the only bells that never cease." By the time Lestrade returned with his men to take Elias Trent into custody, the grey light of morning had spread across the village like a veil, softening the edges of every roof and gravestone. A pale mist still clung to the churchyard, turning the snow into a dull, colourless carpet. The clergyman, Reverend Penrith, emerged from the rectory doorway as the constables led Trent away in irons. His expression was one of heavy bewilderment rather than triumph. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice trembling, "I scarcely know what to say. To think that such wickedness was hatched under my very roof by those I trusted." Holmes inclined his head politely, but said nothing at first. His gaze followed Trent's departing figure, watching the man's boots leave deep impressions in the snow. "Evil rarely blooms in isolation, Reverend. It takes root where pride and grievance already thrive." He paused, then added with quiet emphasis, "You mentioned that Miss Vale claimed her father was cheated of his due by your predecessors. I should like to see the church's founding deeds, those pertaining to the land on which Street Agatha's stands." Penrith blinked. "The deeds? They are in the vestry safe, I believe. But surely this has no bearing on the case now." Holmes's eyes glinted. "On the contrary, it may explain the case entirely." Within the half-hour, we found ourselves back inside the vestry, the air still thick with the residue of oil and soot. Penrith produced an iron key from his coat and unlocked a small safe set into the wall. Inside lay a sheaf of yellowed parchment, neatly bound with ribbon. Holmes spread the documents upon the table, his eyes darting swiftly over each line, his brow furrowing in concentration. He traced one clause with his forefinger and murmured, "As I suspected. The property was originally leased to one Joseph Vale, mason and bell founder, whose heirs were entitled to a portion of the adjoining glebe land. And yet here the signature is not Vale's." He looked up sharply at Penrith. "Do you know this name? Edwin Sturridge?" The Reverend frowned. "Yes. He was vicar here a century ago, before my time, of course. But he was said to have overseen the church's expansion. His portrait still hangs in the rectory." Holmes's lips tightened. "Then your Miss Vale spoke truth. The land was stolen, quietly and legally, by substitution of signature. The deception was never uncovered. The Vale family was defrauded, and their estate dissolved. No wonder she nursed her hatred. I watched him fold the papers carefully. "Holmes," I said, "you speak almost as though you pity her." "I do, Watson," he replied softly. "But pity is not exoneration. She allowed justice to curdle into vengeance, and vengeance is a corrosive acid. It eats both heart and cause." He slipped the documents into his coat. "Still, I shall ensure these papers find their way to the proper authorities. Perhaps the Crown will see fit to restore what remains of the Vale estate. It will not bring back Thomas Avery, but it may lay the ghost that haunts these bells." We stepped outside again. The snow had ceased, leaving the air still and biting. Villagers were gathering in small, anxious knots at the church gate, their faces pale and curious. Word had spread that the haunting was over, though the truth of it would likely pass through many tongues before sunset. Holmes moved among them with his usual composure, speaking little, only observing. It was then that a young boy tugged at his sleeve and pointed toward the belfry. "Sir, look, there's smoke up there." Holmes's eyes shot upward. A faint wisp of grey smoke was indeed curling from one of the tower's narrow slits. Without hesitation, he sprang toward the church, motioning for me to follow. "Watson, someone is burning evidence." We entered through the north door, racing across the nave toward the stair. The acrid scent of burning paper met us halfway. Holmes ascended the spiral at a pace that left me gasping, and as we reached the bell chamber, I saw at once what he meant. A small brazier had been lit beneath one of the great bells, its coals still glowing red. Beside it lay a half-consumed sheaf of documents, the remnants of what appeared to be parish financial ledgers. Holmes snatched them from the flames with his gloves, beating out the fire against the cold stone floor. "Not Miss Vale's hand," he muttered. "She is under guard." "Then who?" A sudden movement drew our eyes upward. From behind, the largest bell emerged. Reverend Penrith, his face pale, his eyes wild. "You should not have opened that safe, Mr. Holmes," he said hoarsely. "You've no notion what these people would do if they knew." Holmes rose slowly, his tone even but dangerous. "The people, Reverend. Or you." Penrith's composure cracked. "It was my grandfather who signed that paper, not Sturridge. The shame of it would destroy our name. My family has kept this church alive for generations. I could not let it all be undone because of one vengeful woman." For a moment, the only sound was the hiss of dying embers. Then Holmes spoke, cold and precise. "So you sought to destroy the evidence and preserve your legacy. How very noble. The sins of the fathers, Reverend, are often carried in silence but never erased by flame." Penrith sank to his knees, trembling. "I never wished harm. I only meant to keep the truth buried." Holmes regarded him with quiet contempt. "The truth, Reverend, like a bell, cannot be uncast once forged. It rings whether men will it or not." He turned to me. "Fetch Lestrade, Watson. Our ghost story is nearly told, but it seems the church itself has a final confession to make." As I descended to summon the inspector, the first rays of sun struck the tower's frost-covered stones. The bells, long silent, gleamed as though washed in fire. And for the first time since our arrival, I fancied they might yet ring again this time, not for the dead, but for the truth. Lestrade's astonished face appeared in the doorway only minutes later, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Behind him clattered two constables, their boots echoing off the tower stones. He stopped short when he saw the Reverend on his knees beside the smouldering brazier, his hands blackened with soot and his composure shattered. "Good Lord, Holmes," Lestrade exclaimed. "What deviltry's this now? I thought the case was done." Holmes gave a dry smile that held no humor. "The devil rarely leaves without collecting his due, Inspector. It seems our pious host has been attempting to erase a century's worth of fraud." He lifted one of the scorched parchments with the tips of his tongs. "These Lestrade, were not church ledgers but proof that the property of Street Agathas was stolen from the Vale family generations ago. Our late Miss Margaret believed she fought for justice, though she never knew the rot had festered all the way to the present vicarage. Lestrade scowled. "You're saying the Reverend here was in on it?" Holmes regarded Penrith coolly. "Not in its inception, but he has lived on its benefits and now sought to conceal them. When Miss Vale's accusations began to gain attention, he must have realized discovery was near. Her theatrics threatened not only his conscience but his position, and so he let the legend of the haunted bells flourish, perhaps even encouraged it, knowing superstition would drown out suspicion." Penrith's voice broke. "No, I swear it was not I who encouraged her madness. I thought her unstable. I wished only to protect the parish from scandal." Holmes's eyes gleamed coldly. "And yet you invited scandal by fire. No, Reverend, you are not a murderer, but you are guilty of cowardice and deceit. Both have caused their share of corpses." Lestrade gave a short grunt. "We'll have the church records taken to London for examination, and the Reverend here will answer for what he's done." But Holmes did not appear satisfied. He walked to the narrow window and gazed out across the white fields. The bells above our heads swayed faintly in the draught, their iron tongues glinting in the pale morning. "There is one more matter, Lestrade," he said quietly. "One ghost yet unlaid the ghost of Thomas Avery." The name hung in the air. Even Penrith looked up, startled. Holmes turned slowly toward him. "You told us, Reverend, that the verger was found hanging, and that you helped break open the door the next morning. Yet you omitted to mention how you knew where to look or why you arrived so early." Penrith blinked, stammering. I rose before dawn, as is my habit on Christmas Eve. I heard the bell strike once and feared some mischief." Holmes's voice dropped. "Curious, then, that the bell did not ring that night. The mechanism Miss Vale built was not yet complete. You could not have heard a sound unless you were already in the tower." The Reverend froze, color draining from his face. Holmes stepped closer, his words sharp as glass. "You confronted Avery there, didn't you? He threatened to reveal your secret to expose the forged signature and your family's complicity. You panicked. In the struggle, he fell against the rope. Perhaps he was still alive when you cut him down. You dragged him beneath the stairs to make it appear he'd vanished, and let the legend of the phantom bells serve as a convenient smokescreen." Penrith's lips moved soundlessly. Then he buried his face in his hands. "I meant only to frighten him," he whispered, "to make him swear silence. He slipped. Oh God, forgive me." He slipped. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind moaned softly through the tower slits, as though the church itself sighed. Then Holmes turned away. "Watson, the rope will confirm it. Blood on the fibers, the same as we found upon the floor." I knelt, examining the cut section Holmes had preserved. Indeed, faint stains still darkened the hemp. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Lestrade exhaled heavily. "That's enough for me. The lady builds her infernal machine, the verger dies, and the vicar tries to cover it all up. It's like a blasted morality play." Holmes gave a weary nod. "Truly, Inspector, human folly seldom writes a simpler script." He looked again at Penrith, who now knelt weeping beside the brazier. "The tragedy here is not in sin alone, but in its echo, each lie ringing out until it calls another, like a peal of bells tolling themselves into ruin." Lestrade motioned to his men. "Take him. We'll have the rest of this business sorted before noon." As they led the Reverend away, Holmes remained staring up into the gloom of the belfry. A faint glimmer of sunlight struck the edge of the great tenor bell, illuminating a Latin inscription carved along its rim. He brushed away the soot to read it aloud. "Veritas resonat, etiam inter silentium." He turned to me with a melancholy smile. "Truth resounds, even amid silence. Fitting, don't you think?" I nodded, feeling an odd weight in my chest. So, the silence of Street Agatha's was not cursed at all, it was only the pause before confession. Holmes looked out across the frost-dusted graves, where the constable's footprints led away into the fog. Precisely, Watson. Every lie tolls its warning, every deceit its requiem, and now the bells will ring again, not for the dead, but for the living who must remember. As we descended the spiral stair, the sound of hammering below announced the workmen preparing to secure the tower door. Holmes paused once more and gazed upward, his silhouette dark against the light from above. "Let them ring freely tonight," he said softly. "Perhaps the village deserves a Christmas Eve of honest sound." And though no hand touched them, the bells seemed to stir faintly as if the air itself breathed their release. The days that followed were cloaked in a kind of uneasy calm. Snow still carpeted the village, though now it lay undisturbed, no longer broken by the hurrying feet of frightened parishioners. Agatha's stood silent against the pale sky, its tower glinting faintly with thawing frost. Word of the strange events spread far beyond Chertsey, of course. By the second morning, journalists from London had arrived like crows upon a battlefield, their notebooks fluttering in the wind as they sought every scrap of gossip. Holmes, however, had already withdrawn from the commotion. He preferred the solitude of the rectory's study, where he spent long hours poring over the recovered parchments and making careful annotations in his own tidy hand. I found him there one afternoon, a thin wisp of pipe smoke curling toward the ceiling. The fire had burned low, casting the room in an amber haze. "Holmes," I said, setting down the day's newspaper, "it seems the whole of England now knows of the haunted bells of Surrey. The Illustrated News has gone so far as to call you the ghost hunter of Baker Street." He gave a quiet snort, a title as idiotic as it is inaccurate. "The world prefers its explanations cloaked in fantasy, Watson. It finds comfort in spectres because they absolve men of responsibility. Yet every phantom is but the shadow cast by human deceit." I smiled. "And still, it must please you that justice is done. Miss Vale will stand trial, but with your testimony, her sentence may be merciful. Reverend Penrith has confessed his concealment, and the Crown has begun proceedings to restore the Vale lands. Even Elias Trent, for all his foolishness, may see leniency for his cooperation." Holmes tapped his pipe against the grate, sending a spray of ash into the hearth. "Justice, yes, but rarely is it so tidy as a magistrate's ledger might suggest. There are debts no court can settle. The Reverend's shame, Miss Vale's grief, Avery's grave, these are tolls no bell can unring." A knock interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered with a tray of tea, flustered by the snow that still clung to her cloak. "Another telegram for you, Mr. Holmes," she said, handing it to him with the air of one who half expected it to burst into smoke. "Came from London this morning, marked urgent." Holmes slit it open, read quickly, and his brows lifted ever so slightly. "Ah, from Lestrade. He has concluded the formal inquest. It seems the coroner's report confirms our reconstruction, precisely Avery's death accidental, though aggravated by Penrith's concealment. The Reverend is to be defrocked and confined under supervision. Miss Vale's trial is postponed pending review of her mental state. It appears she has taken ill since her arrest." "Poor woman," I murmured. "Perhaps the truth has broken her more than her crime." Holmes's gaze softened, though only slightly. "Perhaps conscience, once awakened, is the most relentless judge of all." We sat in silence for a time. The only sound, the ticking of a small mantel clock. Then Holmes rose abruptly, his restless energy returning. "Come, Watson. The villagers have invited us to the evening service. I find myself curious to hear whether the bells of Street Agatha's will indeed ring once more." The church was nearly full when we arrived. The air inside carried the faint sweetness of evergreen garlands, and candles glimmered along the aisle. Yet, beneath the warmth, there lingered something somber, a reverence deeper than joy. When Holmes and I entered, the murmur of voices faltered, and heads turned as if to behold not men but survivors of a legend. Holmes ignored the attention, seating himself quietly near the back. At last, the new curate, a timid young man scarcely out of college, stepped up to the pulpit. His sermon was short, a plea for forgiveness and renewal, his voice trembling as he spoke of truth rising like light through darkness. Then, as he concluded, he turned toward the organ loft and gave a small nod. For a moment there was only silence. Then came a sound, low, resonant, pure. The first bell struck, then the next, until all 6 were pealing in magnificent harmony. The vibration filled the rafters, rolled through the nave, and spilled into the frosted air beyond. It was not mournful now, but bright, like sunlight upon crystal. I looked toward Holmes. He sat perfectly still, eyes half closed, the faintest trace of a smile upon his lips. When the final note faded, he spoke softly enough that only I could hear. "You see, Watson, truth has its own music. However long silenced, it finds a way to sound again." We lingered after the congregation had gone, standing beneath the tower where the ropes swayed gently from the rafters. The air still quivered with the echoes of the bells. Holmes reached out and touched one of the ropes lightly. "Strange, is it not?" he said. "For all our reasoning and deduction, it takes something as simple as a sound to remind men of their better selves." "And what of you, Holmes?" I asked quietly. "Do you ever tire of unmasking shadows?" He turned toward me, his eyes thoughtful. "No, my dear Watson. Shadows are necessary. Without them, light would have nothing to define it." Outside, the snow had begun again, soft, steady, unhurried. As we stepped into the night, the last bell tolled once more. Distant but clear, and I could not help but feel that somewhere, unseen, a restless spirit had finally found its peace. The following morning dawned pale and brittle, the frost lying so thick upon the panes that it veiled the world beyond in a faint shimmer of glass. Holmes had slept little. I could hear him moving restlessly in the adjoining room long before sunrise. When I entered, I found him standing by the window, fully dressed, his gaze fixed on the distant spire of Street Agathas. The village below still slumbered, save for the occasional wisp of smoke curling from cottage chimneys. His expression was unreadable, but I sensed the strange mixture of melancholy and satisfaction that always came to him when a case approached its final reckoning. "Watson," he said without turning, "I have been thinking of our Miss Vale. There is a certain irony, is there not, in the fact that her act of vengeance restored the very truth she sought to avenge." I set down the breakfast tray Mrs. Hudson had sent up. "You mean that her crime exposed the Reverend's deception?" "Precisely. Had she not set her little mechanism in motion, the hidden wrong might have remained buried another century. It is one of those bitter paradoxes I have often observed, that justice, when neglected, will sometimes return through sin's own hand." He lit a cigarette and exhaled thoughtfully. "Still, it is a tragedy of wasted intellect. The woman possessed remarkable ingenuity. In another life, she might have been an engineer, not an outcast." I could not help smiling faintly. "You astonish me, Holmes. You speak almost fondly of her." He shrugged. "I merely recognize quality, even when misdirected. Her contrivance for the bells, though primitive, revealed a grasp of mechanics most uncommon, and yet, that doomed her. But emotion, when reason abdicates to passion, even genius becomes destructive." He turned from the window and began pacing. "I have decided to call upon her before we leave. Lestrade telegraphed that she has regained coherence. The doctors at the infirmary permit a short visit. Would you accompany me?" "Of course," I said, though I confess some unease stirred within me at the prospect. The road to the small county hospital was lined with skeletal elms, their branches glittering under the morning sun. The carriage wheels crunched softly through the frozen ruts. When we arrived, a matron led us to a narrow ward at the far end of the corridor, where a single patient sat by the window. Margaret Vale turned her head as we entered. Her face was pale but composed, her dark hair neatly bound. There was no madness in her eyes now, only a tired clarity. "Mr. Holmes," she said quietly, "I wondered if you would come." He inclined his head. "I rarely visit the aftermath of my cases, Miss Vale, but I thought perhaps a word might be owed to the living as well as the dead." She studied him for a moment, then looked toward the window. Beyond it, faint through the distance, the bells of street Agathas began to ring for the morning service. The sound seemed to strike her like a physical blow. "They ring again," she murmured. "For them, for you, for everyone but him." Holmes's tone was gentle, almost grave. "Thomas Avery died in defense of conscience, Miss Vale. I believe he pitied you even to the end. You might honor him best by forgiving yourself." She laughed softly, though it was a sound without mirth. "Forgiveness? You mistake me, Mr. Holmes. I do not seek forgiveness, only rest." Holmes watched her intently. "Then let this rest be earned by truth, not despair. The Crown will restore your father's name. The parish will know what was done to your family. That is no small victory." She met his gaze then, and for a moment the steel in her eyes returned. "A victory paid in blood is no victory at all. But tell me, when you look upon these tragedies, do you ever wonder, Mr. Holmes, if all your reasoning changes anything? You mend the law, yes, but can you mend the hearts it breaks?" He was silent for several seconds, the faint ticking of the wall clock filling the space between them. At last, he said softly, "No, Miss Vale. I mend nothing. I only reveal what is already broken." She nodded slowly, as if that answer satisfied something deep within her. "Then you understand more than most." Holmes took her hand briefly, a rare gesture of tenderness, and said, "You have courage, madam. Let it not fade." With that, he turned and walked from the room. As we passed down the corridor, I glanced back once. She was still sitting there, gazing at the horizon, where the steeple rose faintly against the sky. The bells continued to toll, each note softer than the last, until even their echo seemed to fade into snow. Holmes did not speak until we reached the carriage. Then he said, almost absently, "It is curious, Watson, how often guilt and innocence wear the same face, differing only by circumstance. The world condemns what it should pity, and pities what it should condemn." I looked at him. "And yet you never falter in judging between them." He smiled faintly, the smoke of his cigarette drifting from his lips. "Judgment? No. Observation? Yes. The former belongs to heaven. The latter, thankfully, to me." The carriage rattled back toward Baker Street, leaving behind the quiet village and its now peaceful tower. But as we passed the last bend, a gust of wind carried faintly to us the distant echo of those bells, steady, solemn, and hauntingly pure. Holmes leaned back in his seat, eyes half closed, and murmured as though to himself, "Ah, Watson, even the truest note fades, but its vibration lingers. That is the way of both sound, truth." The train steamed northward toward London, cutting through a countryside wrapped in frozen mist. Inside our compartment, the warmth of the carriage stove fought against the chill that seeped through the glass. Holmes sat opposite me, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed upon the snow-blurred fields flashing past. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels lent an oddly meditative air to the journey, as though the land itself were reflecting upon the strange tale we left behind. Neither of us spoke for some time. The case had concluded in the eyes of the law. Yet something in Holmes's expression told me his thoughts had not yet left Street Agatha's. At last, I broke the silence. "You are unusually pensive, Holmes. I should have thought the conclusion of such a case would bring you satisfaction. The crime is exposed, justice done, and even the bells restored to their rightful voice." He smiled faintly, though without mirth. "Satisfaction, my dear Watson, is a sentiment for simpler men. What we witnessed in Surrey was not justice, but the faint approximation of it, truth forced to speak only after death has lent it weight. It is a pattern as old as sin. Each man rings his own bell, and the sound is never as pure as he intends. He reached into his coat and withdrew the small, charred scrap of parchment he had rescued from the brazier in the tower. The Latin script was half burnt away, but the remaining words were legible enough. Veritas resonat etiam inter silentium. Truth resounds even amid silence. He read softly. A noble motto for a church that spent a century burying its conscience beneath ceremony and stone. I leaned forward. And yet it was truth that spoke in the end through Miss Vale's misguided vengeance, through your investigation, through the Reverend's confession. Holmes nodded absently. Indeed. But consider, Watson, how fragile that chain of revelation was. Remove a single link, one frightened woman, one guilty cleric, one inquisitive observer, and the silence would have endured another 100 years. Civilization prides itself on reason, yet it depends so entirely on accident. He tapped the parchment against his knee. It is that fragility which fascinates me. How near we dwell to darkness without ever quite falling in. The whistle shrieked as the train plunged into a tunnel, filling the compartment with echoing thunder. When we emerged again, the light had changed warmer now, the late morning sun breaking through the mist. Holmes stirred from his reverie, relit his cigarette, and said with a glint of his old humor, "You know, Watson, I might almost miss those bells. They lent the affair a certain musical symmetry, rare in human affairs." I laughed softly. "You speak as if the case were a sonata." "Perhaps it was," he replied. "Each act a movement allegro in discovery, adagio in confession, andante in redemption. And now, the coda. Peace restored, but the melody forever altered." He exhaled a stream of smoke and added more quietly, "Tell me, Watson, what do you suppose the villagers will remember? The murder and deceit, or the miracle of the bells ringing once more?" "The latter, I hope," I said. "Mankind prefers hope to horror." Holmes gave one of his rare, genuine smiles. "A necessary delusion, perhaps. Without it, churches would be empty and Scotland Yard unemployed." The train slowed as it approached Clapham Junction. Through the window, London's vast sprawl began to appear, a haze of chimneys, rooftops, and distant spires rising from the river fog. Holmes pocketed the parchment, his manner turning brisk once more. "Once we reach Baker Street, I shall write to the Home Office regarding the restitution of the Vale property. It may serve as some token of atonement, and Lestrade will doubtless require a summary of my findings for his official report. He despises my prose, which is why I take such pains to refine it." I smiled. "You never could resist a touch of irony, Holmes." He chuckled softly. "Irony, Watson, is the only means by which an intelligent man survives the company of fools. Besides, it keeps my pen from rusting." We arrived at Baker Street shortly after noon. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with her customary mix of scolding and relief, lamenting our absence as though we had returned from the Arctic. Holmes brushed aside her fussing, removed his coat, and sank into his armchair with a sigh of contentment. "Ah, home again, the one sanctuary where even silence holds no mystery." I settled opposite him, glad to see the familiar glow of our sitting-room fire. The afternoon light slanted across the violin upon the table, and the faint scent of tobacco filled the air. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Holmes leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the flame. "You know, Watson," he said quietly, "there is something profoundly moral in the sound of a bell. Its note is pure, incorruptible. It cannot lie. A man may twist words, falsify records, even mimic remorse, but a bell simply speaks what it must. That is why superstition clings to it. Men sense, perhaps unconsciously, that it is the one voice that cannot be bribed." I regarded him in the firelight, struck once again by the strange duality of his nature, the relentless logician who yet spoke of truth as though it were a living thing. "And what of us, Holmes?" I asked. "Are we not, in our way, bell-ringers too summoning reason to chase away fear?" He looked up, and the faintest smile touched his lips. Perhaps, my dear fellow. But unlike the bells of street, Agatha's, we have no tower to echo our sound. Ours fades as soon as the case is closed. He reached for his violin, tuning it with delicate precision. Still, while it lasts, let us play it well. The bow drew across the strings, releasing a note that hung in the room like light through, mist clear, mournful, yet strangely consoling. I sat back, listening as the melody unfolded, rising and falling with the cadence of memory. Outside, London's bells began to chime the hour, their tones mingling with Holmes's music until they were one and the same reason and faith. Intellect and conscience, bound together in sound, and thus ended the case of the silent church bells. But as I wrote my account later that night, I could not help hearing again that spectral harmony, Holmes's violin answering the far-off bells of the city. It seemed to me a fitting epitaph for all our labors, that truth, once struck, may fade into silence, yet its echo endures in every heart willing to listen.